What's up, guys? It's John from Outlier, and in this video, I'm going to teach you my audio-based approach for getting as much as possible out of your textbook or other learning material. In the video, I talk about a technique called chorusing, and I've actually put together a training video that teaches you exactly how to use chorusing for free. Just click the link in the description to get a free training video and pack of audio files to get you started. Okay, on to the video. Now, audio first is a term that I came up with to sort of distinguish in my mind this method or this way of thinking about studying from what most people do, which is more text focused, right? And I think especially with Chinese, but probably with most other languages too, it's natural to want to focus on text. With Chinese, maybe even more so than other languages because it has a different writing system than what you grew up with, unless you're, a native Japanese speaker by chance. But I think the fact that most Chinese learners are unfamiliar with the script gives us a tendency to focus on the writing even more so than, people learning languages written with the Roman alphabet. So that's why I call this the audio first approach, is because it's to keep it clear in our minds that we need to be focusing on the audio and the text is secondary. And I'll talk about why. Okay, so anyway, so what I want to do, first I'm going to talk about what I used to do when I was studying textbooks before I stumbled across this method. And I think it's fairly representative of what most people do when they're studying a textbook. So what I would do is essentially, let me pull up my notes here. Okay, so I would open my textbook. I would read the lesson, right? Go through the whole lesson and read it. I might pronounce it out loud or whatever, but I'm looking at the text, right? And as I'm going along, I would look up any vocabulary that I don't know in the glossary, right? So, like, for example, with this textbook, this is kind of nice in that, hopefully it focuses. Yep. You've got the dialogue up here, and then down below, you've got the new vocabulary words that appear on that page are defined down at the bottom. Some textbooks are different. They'll have just the dialogue in the front, and then you turn over a few pages, and then you have the glossary. But at any rate, the idea is that I'm reading through the text, looking up any words that I don't know, and trying to fill the gaps in my mind as I'm going along. And, you get to the point that you can read the entire text and you've kind of learned what all these new words mean. And then after that, I would put the audio file in my headphones. Then, I was studying in Taiwan at the time. So a lot of times what I would do is I would study the text at home, or I would study it, say, after class. I would sit at the picnic tables outside the MTC and I would sit and study the text until I had it. And then maybe the next morning on the way to class, I would put the audio files in my headphones and listen to it on the way to class, right? So I'd usually get, 4 or 5 times listening to the audio before I get to class. And I think that's fairly representative of how most people study, is we look at the text. We have a tendency to think of words as being written things. Whereas, if you've taken our Chinese character masterclass, we talk about the 3 attributes of writing, right? And we say speech has 2 attributes, sound and meaning, right? A spoken word is a sound that you create with your mouth, and then the listener hears it and understands what you mean, right? So sound and meaning. Writing adds a 3rd attribute, which is form. It's the physical appearance of the writing. So people have a tendency to think of words as being the writing, right? Where really a word is a spoken thing and writing is just a visual representation of that word. And it's not even a 100% accurate representation. Think about English spelling, right? You can't look at an English word and know exactly how it's pronounced just from the spelling if you've never heard it pronounced before. Sometimes you can make a good educated guess if you're a native English speaker. But you can't be 100% accurate unless you hear it pronounced, right, by somebody who knows how to pronounce it. That's why, a lot of times people who have only ever read a certain word and never actually heard it said out loud, the first time they try to use it in conversation, a lot of times it's they mispronounce it. Anyway, the point being that we have a tendency to think of words as being these written things. And this audio first approach is meant to shift us from thinking in those terms to focusing on sound, which is really what language is. It is sound, and the writing is just a visual representation of that sound. So this is what I was doing basically for the first few years that I was self-studying when I lived in the US. That's essentially the approach that I would take. And also for the first several months that I was studying in Taiwan at the MTC, that's basically what I would do. It wasn't until I got a little further along and like to an intermediate level and picked up this book to study on the side. And I've mentioned this book on our YouTube channel before. You may know it. And I'm not necessarily endorsing, saying that you should go pick this book up. It is a really good textbook. But the audio is hard to find. So unless you are able to get a copy of the audio as well, I would not recommend the book necessarily, because really the audio is the thing. But the reason I'm bringing this book up is, I was, and I've talked about this on our YouTube channel too, I was trying to model my own study routine after what they do at ICLP, which is this very prestigious Chinese language school in Taipei. And so basically I would do, whatever we were studying in class, I would do that. And then I would also, because I was on scholarship, I didn't have to work. I worked some, but not very much. And so I just had a lot of free time to study other stuff on the side. So what I was doing is, going to the ICLP website, looking at the curriculum, and choosing other textbooks to study on the side of whatever I was doing in class at the MTC. And this is one of the ones that I ended up picking up. And in the introduction of the book, to me at the time, it was a gold mine because I was trying to figure out what the secret sauce is at ICLP, right? And really, the secret sauce is their instruction. They have fantastic teachers. They have very specific methods of teaching. But I didn't know what those were because I wasn't a student there, and it's hard to find very much information. But this book has a section in the introduction called Pedagogy. And I'm going to read most of this here, and I'm going to put the text up on the screen while I'm reading it. But it really unlocked things for me. It really gave me some really concrete, actionable things that I could do in my study to make it much more effective. And to really, my goal at the time was to more closely model my studying on whatever they were doing at ICLP. So up until that point, I thought it was about the selection of textbooks, right? And it is. They have fantastic textbooks there. But this let me see that it's really also about how they're telling their students to study. So I'm going to read this to you, this pedagogy section. So it should be emphasized that these materials are designed for training in the spoken language. Therefore, the tapes are of primary importance. The tapes, obviously, it's audio files now, but this book was first made in, I think, the 80s. And I don't think it's really been changed much since then. Well, 2000 was the last time. But anyway, so tapes. Therefore, the tapes are of primary importance. The glosses are secondary, and the texts of the plays are only of tertiary significance. Okay, so that's exactly the opposite of what I was saying earlier, right? What I did was I would read the text first. They're saying that should come third. And then I would look at the vocabulary glosses while I was reading the text, and then I would listen to the audio. They're saying go completely in the opposite direction. So this was a huge realization for me. The first objective is training and listening comprehension. The second objective is to use the speech forms of the plays insofar as is appropriate in the judgment of the teacher, as modal, I'm not really sure what that means, as modal the utterances for expanding the student's active spoken language competence. The text can, of course, also be used for reading and writing practice, but such use should be subordinated to the oral and oral functions of the materials. The most effective study technique and teaching methodology will vary to some extent according to each individual student's Chinese language background, level of competence, and oral aptitude. Ideally, the student should begin preparation of a lesson by listening to an entire play without stopping the tape. So this book is mini radio plays, right? And they're actually little short plays taken from Taiwanese radio and then transcribed. So ideally, the student should begin preparation of a lesson by listening to an entire play without stopping the tape. Each play is only 9 or 10 minutes long. Attention should at first be concentrated not on individual words, but on getting as much as possible of the gist of the action and narration. First exposure to the entire play should be followed by a second and a third time through, perhaps stopping occasionally to catch up mentally with the flow of speech, but without reserving the tape for repeated listening to difficult passages. So it's saying basically, listen straight through once without stopping it, without just try to get the gist of what's going on. Second and third time, you can pause it and then continue, but don't rewind to re-listen to stuff that you don't get. Just listen and try to get through, try to understand as much as possible without actually, rewinding, and stop if you need to kind of catch up and go, okay, what did they just said? Okay, it was this, I think, right? And only after several runs through the entire play should assistance be sought in the glossary. So once you've listened to the entire thing a few times, then you can go look at the vocabulary glosses. Students at a somewhat lower level of oral competence in the language, however, might find it more effective to break a play into several sections of 2 or 3 minutes each for more detailed listening before attempting to comprehend the entire play. In any case, it's important to remember that class time should not be used for listening practice that the student can do on his own with the tape recorder. And the teacher should not be used as a convenient dictionary. After all problems of comprehension have been overcome, and thus perhaps after 1 or 2 classroom sessions on the play, the students should listen to the entire play several more times to gain thorough familiarity with the new words and constructions introduced in the play. Now notice, we have not looked at the text yet at all. We're only listening and occasionally looking stuff up if you don't understand. The text of the play should not be used as a direct aid to listening comprehension. On the contrary, students should find it useful after having thoroughly understood a play orally to follow the text while listening as an aid to improving reading speed. Now, that's interesting, right? I mean, that's completely different from what I was doing before. In the classroom, the teacher should determine through question and answer dialogue whether the student has completely understood the material on tape and should then provide assistance with especially difficult passages. If the student has listened to the tape several times while preparing for class and then made full use of the glossary, there will usually be relatively little that requires the teacher's explanation. If, in fact, there is still a great deal that remains incomprehensible, then the student may not yet be ready for these materials. Class time, or in our cases, possibly time with your tutor or with your language exchange partner, should be spent principally on the second objective, that is, in developing active control of the new vocabulary and patterns presented in the lessons. The teacher, having of course prepared thoroughly by listening to the tape and taking notes, should engage the student in conversation designed to elicit use of vocabulary and patterns presented in the play, correcting errors in pronunciation, vocabulary, and structure, and honing the student's sensitivity to intonation, diction, and the emotional content of the dialogue of the play. It is very good to include sentence writing exercises as a regular part of assigned homework. While such exercises should clearly be subordinated to the oral aspects of the course, they will provide valuable reinforcement of the learning of the speech forms. Okay, so I wanted to read that entire passage for you just because it was so useful for me when I was studying. But let's kind of summarize, what it's talking about in, I guess, more plain English. So there's essentially 3 steps. Step 1, you listen to the entire dialogue until you can understand it 100%. Step 2, once you understand everything, Then you open the book and read the text while you're listening. And then step 3 is to, do conversational drills with your tutor or with your language exchange partner or teacher, and to do some writing drills as homework. So let's go through each of those a little bit. So step 1, you listen to the whole dialogue repeatedly until you understand it 100%. So you don't look at the text. For any words, what I would do is, while I'm listening, do the first 3 passes, one time without stopping, just try to get the gist. One time where you can pause, or 2 times where you can pause and mentally catch up, but still not rewinding or re-listening to anything. Just go straight through and pause if you need. And then after those 3 listens, what I would do is go through and listen to the audio. And for any words that you don't understand or that you're not sure about, look them up. You can look them up in the glossary in your textbook, or you can just pull out Plico and look it up there so that you're not tempted to look at the text in the textbook, right? But just keep going through the audio, filling in those gaps by looking stuff up either in Plico or in your textbook glossary until you can understand the whole thing. And you can break it into smaller chunks if you want. Like they said, instead of a 10-minute play, break it into 2 or 3 minute chunks and work through each chunk until you can understand the entire thing. And just keep iterating until you can understand the entire play, without having to look anything up or without having to pause. And while you're doing it, you can shadow if you want and stuff like that. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So once you've understood everything, once you can listen to the entire thing and catch every word, then, open the book and read the text. And what they mentioned is you can use that as basically a way of improving your reading speed. So you have the audio playing and you have to read along at the same speed that the people are talking, right? Now, if your reading speed is fairly slow, that might be pretty difficult, right? So what you could do is to break that down into just like what you did with listening to the audio in the first place. You can, I think that was a boat outside. I don't know if the microphone picked it up or not, but you can, the same thing with the reading. You can pause the audio and mentally catch up with the reading, right? If it's too fast for you, and just gradually try to do that less and less until you're able to catch up with the entire, or to keep up with the audio while reading, right? And then, learn whatever characters you may not know that appear in the text. There's likely to be a few at least, right? And then learn, any of the written words that you don't know, put them in your flashcard program or whatever it is you use to keep track of your new vocabulary. And then, in class or with your tutor or language exchange partner, try to focus as much as possible on oral proficiency. Now, why is that? Well, what you can listen to and understand will always be way more, or at least significantly more, than what you're able to use in conversation, right? If you can say it, you can definitely understand it, right? As long as you don't have serious pronunciation issues where you can say a word, but nobody can really understand you because you've got the wrong mental model of the language in your mind. And so when they do say it correctly, you can't understand it because it doesn't fit with what you think the language sounds like. If that's you, I really recommend our pronunciation course because it's designed to fix that sort of thing. Or chorusing and shadowing, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So your active skills are never going to be as strong as your passive skills. That's only normal. So what that means is if you focus your practice time with your language exchange partner or tutor or teacher, if you focus that time on oral proficiency, being able to use the stuff in conversation, well, you're definitely going to be able to understand it when you hear other people use it, right? So that time shouldn't be focused on listening practice. If you do listening practice, during that time, then, make sure that you're also getting plenty of speaking practice. And then, step 3, like I said, is doing some writing exercises as homework, right? Because you definitely want to focus on all 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, right? But I think the magic of ICLP's way of teaching this stuff is that they put such a high focus on oral proficiency, on being able to use stuff in speech. And the other skills are sort of subordinate to that, right? Because if you can use it in speech, you're going to be able to hear it, or you're going to be able to understand it when you hear somebody else use it, right? If you can use it in speech and you know the characters for the word, you're going to be able to read it when you see it. If you can use it in speech and you know how to write the characters, you're going to be able to write the word in a composition, right? So that sort of oral proficiency first type of focus that they have really makes a lot of sense, because your other skills will fall in line behind the oral proficiency. Okay. Now there's another article, and I don't think I can link to the article because I think the website is no longer active. And I'm gonna read part of it for you here, because this is another one that really helped me. Because the ICLP one is good. I mean, it's step by step, but I really think this article by Tom Mason really helps you to, I guess, get the most, like to squeeze the most juice possible out of each lesson in your textbook, right? And so he kind of picks up where New Radio Plays left off, that passage that I was just reading, and says, okay, now once you understand everything 100%, what do you do after that? I mean, not just practicing in class with your teacher, but like in your study time. And so he's outlined a method for really solidifying that knowledge, and I think it's really brilliant. So I'm going to read a bit. Melissa is an intermediate student studying talks on Chinese culture. Now, again, the actual textbook isn't that important, although TOCC is a good textbook. A collection of speeches and dialogues consisting of a heavy dose of complex sentence structures and new vocabulary. Melissa begins her Chinese study by listening to the assigned materials audio 2 or 3 times without glancing at the text, just like what we just read, right? She's usually assigned 3 or 4 pages a day. Each page is usually 2 minutes of audio. So listening to the text usually takes 10 to 15 minutes. Of course, given that the assigned material is new, she usually only gets a gist of the meaning during these first 2 or 3 run-throughs. After listening 2 or 3 times, she starts listening to each sentence one by one, stopping at the end of each sentence to reference the vocabulary list or written text, making sure that she understands the meaning of each phrase, connection, sentence, and paragraph. She notes what she doesn't understand and follows up with her instructor the next day. Up until this point, Melissa's study method is similar to that of most students. And here he's talking about most students at ICLP, right? And so they're actually following this sort of approach to studying that I just read from the New Radio Plays book. Up until this point, Melissa's study method is similar to that of most students. It's from here that the methods diverge and true interaction with the audio material begins. Okay, so this is the good stuff, how to really squeeze the juice out of it. After completely understanding the text, Melissa then closes the textbook and starts working exclusively with the audio material. She starts at S1, or sentence 1, listens to the audio for just that one sentence. She vocalizes or repeats aloud what she hears, paying close attention to meaning, pronunciation, and tones. Given this is TOCC, S1 is long and complex, consists of 3 new and substantial grammar patterns and numerous new vocabulary items. Using the GOM media player, I'm not sure if that is still available, but you can do the same thing with Audacity, which is free. She creates an A-B repeat cycle at the beginning and end of S1. She may even need to break down the long sentence into smaller A-B repeat phrases. Using the A-B repeat button, she replays S1 and vocalizes after the audio. So this is shadowing, right? This is exactly what shadowing is. You hear the audio and then you repeat it. Chorusing is different in that with chorusing, you hear the audio and say it at the exact same time in unison, right? So generally you put it on repeat. So there's like a rhythm to the sentence repeating over and over. And then you can get into like saying it over and over and over in unison. And that it's useful because it helps you to hear exactly where your pronunciation differs from the audio. Shadowing, which is what is it Melissa is doing in this text, is repeating it with a delay. So you hear the sentence, and then after you hear the sentence, you say it, right? And really, I think a good study method should incorporate both of those. For sentences that you have particular problems with, do chorusing, because that really helps you to iron out those problems. For sentences that don't give you any particular difficulty, shadowing is good enough, right? Because chorusing is more intensive, whereas shadowing you can do for longer passages and longer periods of time. She continues to replay and vocalize S1 25 or 30 times before she's able to say the sentence at the same speed as the audio. Now, here, doing that, I would actually recommend chorusing instead. But, he may not have been aware of this technique. So even though she's a bit embarrassed to do so in the computer room with her friends nearby, again, this is talking about at ICLP, she vocalizes in a clear, strong voice. In total, it takes her 2 to 3 minutes to be able to say S1 accurately. But when she's finished, she has said the sentence so many times that she's internalized all of the new grammar patterns and vocabulary. She has no need to use flashcards to learn new vocabulary because she's learned the new vocabulary during her vocalization. Ever the good student, she's been paying attention to meaning and tones during the whole process. In addition, since she now has an internalized knowledge of the new sentence patterns, instead of just having a passive understanding, she is able to actively produce sentences in real conversation using these patterns. So what does Melissa do after conquering S1? She moves on to S2 and does the exact same thing. A-B repeat, breaking the sentence into smaller phrases, paying attention to meaning and tones, and internalization. Practice on S2 takes only 30 seconds or so because there are no difficult sentence patterns and only 2 new vocabulary items. So what happens next? Does Melissa move to S3? No, she returns to S1 and works on S1 again. This is called looping. Looping is essential because our brain needs constant review in order to move newly acquired material from short-term memory to long-term memory. Melissa only spends 20 seconds on S1 this time, a far cry from the 3 minutes she spent the first time, and then quickly reviews S2 and only then finally moves to S3. She hits the play button on GOM Player and starts interacting with the S3 audio. An abundance of new sentence structures means this sentence takes 2 or 3 minutes to conquer. She has the A-B button set and determinedly listens and vocalizes, breaking down the sentence into workable sizes and engaging in backwards build-ups, and continues to listen and vocalize until she has a complete internalization of S3. Internalization occurs when Melissa herself is able to produce the sentence or phrase accurately by just glancing at the text. Yes, it's okay to glance at the text. Our aim is not memorization. We're shooting for internalization. Before moving to S4, she loops back to S1, S2, S3, interacting with each sentence along the way. She continues the pattern. S1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Upon making it through the entire assigned text in the above fashion, Melissa focuses on the written text, reads the material for meaning and character practice for a final time. The next day, she loops back to the previous day's assignment, reviews the material once by audio, interacts with the lesson's audio quickly. It only takes her 10 minutes today because she still retains what she learned yesterday. And then she starts on the newly assigned material. I will be the first to admit that this kind of practice is time-consuming. It is. It's also mentally demanding because there's no passive listening. The student is always interacting with the audio, paying attention to every detail of meaning, structure, and pronunciation. Okay, so essentially what Tom Mason is outlining here is, once you've done what it says in ICLP's textbook, how to go through and really squeeze everything out of each sentence in the text, right? until you've internalized everything there. And of course, it's intensive. Like he said, it takes a lot of time. But doing this and doing it with good quality textbooks will bury this stuff so deep in your brain that you're not going to forget it, right? It's going to become part of you. That's the internalization that he's talking about. And that internalization, there's something about the way that our brains process sound versus visual text that makes that internalization much stronger if you're doing this via sound. There's a phenomenon that Stephen Krashen calls the din in the head. And that's where, like, how to explain this? So if you've ever played like a video game, a puzzle game especially, right? And it's a new game you've never played before, or a game maybe you haven't played a long time, right? Say you sit down and you play an hour or two of Tetris and you haven't played Tetris in 20 years. You know, when you do that, and then when you go to sleep, your brain is like replaying Tetris while you're trying to fall asleep. It's a really similar phenomenon to the din in the head. So that's sort of visual problem solving that your brain is processing and then replaying in your head. It does the same thing with audio or with sound. So if you hear, you're trying to learn Chinese and you're doing really intensive work with lots of Chinese audio, right, during the day. A lot of times what happens is after you've done that for a while, your brain is like randomly replaying little bits and phrases of Chinese, right? It might not even make any sense. But what that phenomenon is your brain trying to organize and make sense of all this new information that it's getting. And so it kind of replays that. And and when we sleep, our sleep cycle kind of solidifies that new knowledge, allows your brain to sort it all and make sense of it, so that it goes into your memory more. And audio triggers this din in the head response way more effectively than text does. So, and what that allows us to do is just to really bury that material into our souls, right? I mean, it makes the internalization much more powerful versus just, mostly focusing on text and just listening to a bit of audio, right? So that's the method I essentially recommend to go through your textbook, is use what they talk about in new radio plays, listen to the text a few times, to get the gist, and then start looking up words that you don't know. But don't look at the text. Just listen to the audio. And once you understand the entire audio lesson, 100%, then you open up the book and look at the text. You do drills in class with your teacher, writing practice, but also go through each sentence in the text and do this shadowing routine that Tom Mason recommends. And you'll find, as you're doing this, like he said, Melissa on sentence 2, right? It only took her 30 seconds, right? Because some sentences are going to be easy. Some sentences aren't going to contain anything new. And so you'll just be able to go through them really quickly. And then some sentences are going to require a lot more focus, right? And for those sentences, he like I said, he doesn't recommend chorusing specifically, but what he's doing is it gets pretty close to chorusing, where you're saying the same sentence 25 or 30 times in the space of 2 or 3 minutes. That can be made much more effective if you put it on repeat and say it in unison. And if you're not sure about chorusing, I made a video a few months back that you can find, or I'll put a link in the description of this video to the video that I made demonstrating chorusing. And then shadowing, like I said, is about, hearing it and then repeating it after you hear it, right? Rather than doing it in unison. And so what I would say is the sentences that are easy for you, shadowing is adequate, right? You hear the sentence, you repeat it, you have no problems, you move on. When you hit a sentence that gives you a lot of trouble, I would say chorus it for a few minutes rather than doing A-B repeat shadowing like he's recommended Melissa. I would say chorusing, but try it both ways and see what you prefer, right? And if you approach your textbooks in this way, if you really put in the time to bury the audio in your mind, it's crazy what it does to your, not just your memory, but your fluency and your ability to talk to people. It starts to become much more natural because you've internalized this stuff and you don't really have to think about it. It just pops out. But also your memory. I mean, there are passages of not this textbook, but Thought and Society, another text. I don't have it here with me, but it's one I've talked about a lot. If you've watched our stuff on YouTube, you've probably heard me talk about it. There are passages of Thought and Society that even still, I mean, it's been 12 years since I studied that book. There are still passages I could spit out verbatim, just because of having approached the text in that way. And I mean, I think that kind of demonstrates how powerful this method is, right? I mean, I've been living in Japan for I said 12 years. It hasn't been 12 years. It's been like 10 years since I did Thought and Society. But I've been in Japan for the last 8 years. I don't speak Chinese that often. I speak it occasionally, but not very often and not intensively. It's like chit chat stuff. I read, but the fact that I haven't, I've been living outside of a Chinese speaking environment. I mostly speak English and a little Japanese, but there are still passages from that textbook that I studied 10 years ago that I could recite verbatim, right? I mean, that's the power of internalizing the audio in this way. If I had just focused on reading the text, there's no way I would be able to do that, right? Because it's, like I said, it's something about the way our brains process sound that just really buries that into your memory way more than text would. So that's essentially it. That's the audio first approach, of burying your textbooks in your mind. And it's, if you take an approach like me, where I was studying several textbooks at a time, you don't have to do that with all this. It's too much. But what I would say, what I always did is I always had a core textbook that I thought, okay, this is the one that I'm really focusing on. And the other stuff is sort of supplementary. So whatever your core material is, and we'll talk about, I'm going to do I'm going to write an article about what to look for in a good textbook, and how to choose what's going to be your core text versus supplementary if you choose to go that way. Some people just don't have time for that, which is understandable. But I would say use this approach in your core text. And then, if you're doing supplemental stuff, then just, there's no reason to be that intensive about your supplemental material. But I think if you start taking this approach to studying your textbooks or to studying whatever material it is that you're going through, you'll see a huge difference. It's going to feel weird to study this way at first if you haven't done it like this before. But I think after getting into the rhythm of it and how to do it, I think you'll see how powerful it is and how much better you learn and master the material, right? So yeah, I recommend, experimenting with this. Like I said, you can do some, test what works for yourself. And, if you prefer the shadowing instead of chorusing, that's fine, but the point is to focus on the audio. That's the primary thing, right? Just exactly the opposite of what I was doing, where I would read and then look up stuff and then listen to the audio. The audio needs to be the focus. And that's, when I talk about what textbooks to look for, that's priority number one. Does it have good audio? One of the books that I bought for learning Japanese, it has great texts, fantastic dialogues, but the audio is so slow and unnatural. It's literally like hayaku ikimashou, which is just insane. I mean, that's not how people talk ever. So why would you want that in the audio for your textbook? right? It should be like, hayaku ikimashou. That's like a normal way of speaking that sentence in Japanese. So I just hired a friend to re-record all the audio because it was just unusable. But that's what I would say is focus on audio. But I'll get into more. I'll get into that more in the in the article about how to choose a textbook. But yeah, that's all for this time, guys. I hope you try this and incorporate it into your study because it really will make a massive difference to how well you learn the material. So, all right, that's all for this time. I'll see you again in a future video. Take care. All right, so that covers it. And please check out the link in the description where I give you some more intensive training on the chorusing technique. It's totally free and it's super effective. All right, I'm John from Outlier, and I'll see you next time.